Okay, so, we're always diving into interesting stuff here, right? And this time you guys have really brought it with this idea that traditional education can sometimes feel kind of passive, and this Learnography thing as an alternative.
Yeah, it's a pretty provocative concept.
It is. It is. So today we're going to try to unpack this whole critique of how learning happens in the traditional sense and see how learnography wants to turn us into, well, the source calls them active writers of knowledge.
Yeah, I really liked that when I was looking at the stuff you sent over. The way it frames this contrast, right, between
Hmm.
passive learning and these active writers. It's really interesting. Like makes you think about, okay, what really helps us learn and remember things? And hopefully by the time we're done here, you'll have a better sense of how this learnography thing works and why it might actually matter to you when you're trying to, learn something new and really get it.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the critique of traditional education. What are the main points about where it might not be doing the best job at creating these active learners?
Well, the core argument is that traditional classrooms tend to focus way too much on memorization, and the teacher being the one in control, you know. Like, picture the classic classroom, rows of desks, everyone sitting quietly, listening to the teacher lecture, and the main goal is to remember all those notes for the next exam.
Right. You're more like a sponge just soaking it all up.
Exactly. And the source's point is that while you might absorb some information that way, it doesn't really get you to, actively engage with the material.
Yeah, it's like you said, being a passive recipient.
Right, right. And the source makes the point that this doesn't just make learning boring, it actually limits how well we learn, period.
It's like it's preventing us from reaching our full learning potential or something.
Exactly. There's this really powerful phrase the source uses, passive recipients of teaching, rather than active builders of knowledge modules.
Okay, knowledge modules. Interesting. So it's saying that real learning is about actually building something in your mind, not just passively receiving information.
That's the idea. And then it breaks down how traditional education tends to encourage this passivity in four main ways.
Okay, let's break those down then. What are the specific things that contribute to this passive learning environment, according to the source?
So the first one is teacher-centered instruction. A lot of times in traditional classrooms, the teacher is the main source of knowledge, right? Like they're the expert and the students are there to absorb what they say. And so the flow of information is mostly one way, teacher to student. And that can make it hard for students to really explore things on their own or dig into questions they're curious about.
Yeah, like they're being led on a very specific path, no room to wander off and explore on their own.
Right. It's like you're not really driving your own learning.
Okay, so that's one. What's the second way traditional education might lead to passivity?
The second point is the emphasis on memorization over understanding. The source says that often the focus becomes just remembering facts and notes for the test instead of really grasping the concepts. And that means, a lot of times you don't actually learn the material in a way that sticks with you or that you can use later on.
It's like you cram for the exam and then poof, it's gone. Been there, done that.
Totally. And that's a big part of the problem the source is highlighting.
Okay, makes sense. What about the third factor, limited autonomy?
Right. So this one's about how traditional education often has a fixed curriculum. You know, there's not much flexibility for students to choose what they want to learn or how they want to learn it. And that lack of control can actually make you less motivated and curious. It turns learning into something you have to do, not something you want to do.
It makes it feel like a chore, not an adventure.
Exactly. Like everyone's on this conveyor belt moving at the same speed, whether or not they're interested in what's being presented.
And that brings us to the fourth point about passive learning environments in traditional classrooms, right?
Right. The fourth one is about the passive classroom environment itself. Think about how a typical classroom is set up. Students are supposed to be quiet, still, and obedient,
Yeah.
right? But the source argues that that actually goes against how our brains naturally learn.
So our brains are wired to learn by doing, exploring, experimenting, not by sitting still and listening.
That's the argument. It's saying we're naturally active learners.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good picture of the critique. Too much focus on the teacher, on memorizing, not enough freedom or activity. That all leads to what the source calls those passive recipients. But now let's look at the other side of things. Learnography and these active writers. So first of all, what is learnography exactly?
So learnography is presented as this kind of radical new model where the goal is to completely change the way we learn. It wants to take students from being those passive recipients to being what it calls active writers of knowledge transfer.
Okay, active writers. I like that image. It's very dynamic.
Right. And it's based on motor science and brainpage theory. The idea is that to really master something, you need to learn by doing, by taking action.
So it's not just about sitting back and absorbing, it's about actively engaging with the material.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does learnography try to build these active writers? What are some of the key mechanisms?
There are a few key things it focuses on. The first one is called book-to-brain knowledge transfer. So instead of the teacher being the main source of information, it's the book itself. Students learn to directly extract information from the book, organize it, and make it their own by developing these things called brainpage modules.
Brainpage modules, what are those?
So these modules are like mental frameworks that help you understand and remember information better. It's like you're building a structure in your mind to hold all the knowledge.
So it's not just about memorizing facts, it's about creating a system for understanding and remembering them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this whole idea of building mental frameworks actually lines up with a lot of research on how our brains learn.
Yeah.
But the way they bring in this motor aspect, that's a newer idea.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what kind of knowledge this motor engagement really works best for.
That's a good question.
So it's about changing where the information comes from and making the student the active player in bringing that information in and organizing it in their own minds. And this leads to the second mechanism, brain page development.
Yeah, so a brain page is kind of like a mental map of the knowledge you've built in your brain. Instead of just passively listening to someone talk about it, you're actually creating this brain page through the process of learning and engaging with the material.
So is this saying that by actively working with the material, we actually change the physical structure of our brains?
In a way, yeah.
Hmm.
Like the more you use certain neural pathways, the stronger those connections become.
Wow. So it's not just about what you know, it's about how your brain is literally wired.
That's a big part of it.
Okay, and what's the third thing learnography does to build active writers?
The third one is miniature schools for collaborative learning. These aren't your typical big classrooms. They're smaller groups of students who learn together and kind of drive their own learning experience.
So they're working together to explore ideas and solve problems, more like a team than a class.
Exactly. And that helps them develop skills like leadership, teamwork, and independent thinking.
It's almost like they're creating their own little learning communities.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so that's three. What about the fourth one? Motor science activation. We touched on this a bit earlier. How does that play into building active writers?
This is where the action part really comes in. So there are these parts of your brain, like the substantia nigra and the basal ganglia, that are really important for movement and for learning by doing.
Right, so by actually doing something physical, we activate these parts of our brains.
Yes, and according to the source, when you engage these parts of the brain, you remember information much better than if you just hear it.
It's like when you learn how to ride a bike, you don't forget it. But if you just read about it, you probably will.
Exactly. And that's why learnography focuses so much on building action and movement into the learning process.
Makes sense. And the fifth and final element of building these active writers is student-led learning.
Yeah, so in learnography, students are given a lot of responsibility for their own learning, especially the ones who are already pretty advanced. They're called knowledge writers in the source.
So it's about giving them the tools and then letting them take the reins.
Exactly. And that helps them develop things like self-discipline, curiosity, and problem-solving skills, all those things that are super important for succeeding in life.
It's about empowering them to become lifelong learners, not just students in a classroom.
Right. Like if I'm working in a field that's constantly changing, I need to be able to learn new things on my own, not just wait for someone to teach me.
So the big shift here is really about giving students the power and the responsibility to take charge of their education. From how they engage with the material, to how they work with others, to how they learn through doing. Now, the source also talks about why these active writers are so important in today's world, especially with how fast things are changing. What's the main argument there?
The main point is that the world is changing so rapidly. And to keep up, we need to be able to learn new things quickly and let go of old information that's no longer relevant.
And the source says that people who are used to just being told what to do, they're going to struggle in this kind of environment.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to have a harder time adapting to new situations and challenges.
Whereas these active writers, they've got the skills and the mindset to thrive in this kind of world.
Right. They're able to learn independently, analyze information critically, and come up with creative solutions.
So it's not just about what you know, it's about how you learn.
Exactly. And the source lists some specific abilities that these active writers develop, like critical thinking, self-reliance, skill mastery, and leadership.
Yeah. That makes sense. It's almost like these are the core skills you need to navigate a complex and constantly evolving world. But I do wonder, while teacher-centered instruction might have its downsides, are there times when, having that direct guidance from an expert is still the most effective way to learn something, especially when it's a really complicated topic?
Hmm, that's an interesting point.
So we've covered a lot here. As we wrap up our deep dive into this source, what are the key takeaways that the author leaves us with?
So the main takeaway is that traditional education, with its emphasis on memorization and teacher-led instruction, often creates passive learners, and that this can leave students unprepared for the challenges of the modern world.
And the solution, according to the source, is learnography.
Right. Learnography offers this alternative path where students become active writers through brainpage development, motor science activation, and all those other things we talk about.
So it's a call to move away from the traditional model and embrace something new.
Yes, exactly. The source calls it the Takshila awakening, this shift from passive classrooms to active, self-directed learning.
So just to recap, we've looked at how traditional education might be creating passive learners and how learnography aims to cultivate active writers.
Right. We talked about the four main ways traditional education encourages passivity, those being teacher-centered instruction, memorization over understanding, limited autonomy, and passive classroom environments. And we looked at how learnography tries to address these issues through its five key mechanisms.
And we discussed why these active writers, with their critical thinking skills, self-reliance, mastery, and leadership, are seen as better equipped to succeed in today's rapidly changing world.
Yeah, we covered a lot.
So thinking about your own experiences with learning and how you approach mastering new information, does this idea of passive versus active learning resonate with you? Do you see yourself more as a passive recipient or an active writer? And if this brain page concept is real, how can we be more intentional about building these mental frameworks in our own areas of interest?
Those are some good questions to think about.
Hmm.
All of this was based on why education creates passive learners, how learnography builds active writers by Shiva Narayan Takshila Page. If you're interested in exploring this further, I recommend checking out System Learnography and the Takshila model. It's a pretty unique and thought-provoking perspective on education and learning.
Definitely worth a look. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening, keep those questions coming. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.